Well, here's one of my latest jobs to come through the door. It's a jigsaw puzzle. So it's a Retina IIa, but I've got to do a quick stock take and find out what's here and what's not. So I'll start with the main body that I can see here. This was, I believe this was someone's repair project, so it's probably been serviced or partly serviced. Final assembly certainly hasn't been done. The focus is nice and smooth, which leads me to believe someone has been in there and dealt with that. Remove that rubber band, which has gone all sticky. Okay, so far so good. That's the main body. It's obviously missing the shutter assembly and the rangefinder and the film advance lever. Here's the rangefinder and the two screws that hold the rangefinder in place. The rangefinder looks clean. The movement, it swings well, no problems. What else have I got here? The retainer ring for the shutter and lens assembly. The shutter and lens assembly. Let's have a look at this. Okay, we've got a rubber band around that for some reason. Not sure what purpose that serves. Contour rapid shutter. And there's a, looks like there's a problem there. That arm should not be free to move unless the shutter is cocked. And if the shutter is cocked, of course, that should release it. I noticed that the rack on the side here is very stiff and reluctant to move. So there's a problem there in the shutter, one that will certainly need to be attended to. There are no shims at the back of the shutter. There aren't always shims, but more often than not there's at least one paper or metal shim present. Bag of stray components. Let's see what we've got. The rewind knob, and I instantly see this is an early model of the camera because it's got the small rewind knob. The spacing collar that goes under the rewind knob. The film advance lever. Now this is worth checking to make sure all the components are present. That something nasty going on there. Okay, so there's our lever. There is the frame counter spring or pawl. The end's broken off it, so it needs a new one of those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 other components of the film advance lever are all present. The screw with its retaining star washer is present. Two chrome screws here. One of them is definitely the correct screw for the top cover of a Retina IIa. This one is not. It's longer. If you were to use that on the advance end here, it would foul this cam plate here and stop it from rotating. So that if you're using a longer screw because you've lost the original, always put it at the rewind end. But that'll get us by. That spacer goes underneath the advance lever on top of the gear here on that shaft. Here is the broken end of that frame counter spring or pull. Here is the cocking rack, and here we have a stray spring. Now that spring looks to me like the spring from the shutter, so I suspect that's where it came from. A quick look in the shutter might reveal the answer there. So I'll unscrew the front lens. Oh, the whole front disc is loose. The shutter speed cam is loose. There is no spring. Okay. Alright, this one's a bitzer. Oh, it's a contour rapid shutter, not a synchro contour. No, that's alright. That lever is bent by the looks of it. I'll check that. I suspect it's bent. The spring is missing from this piece here. This is referred to as the main drive, the main lever. The shutter blades are fairly marked. They're not particularly oily, but probably need to be polished. Oh, there's something really ugly going on here at the back. The lens. The lens has been broken. You can only achieve that in a couple of ways. One would be by using some very inappropriate tool on it, and the second would be to drop the shutter on the ground when it was removed from the camera. In this case, given that the side is whacked in fairly well at the side there, that's where the crack propagates across that glass. I would say that the shutter was removed from the camera and then it was dropped onto a hard surface, perhaps a concrete floor. So it'll need a replacement for this lens. It's a shame because the inner lens there looks quite good, but this is all one piece. Then we have a retainer ring here, which we're never going to be able to get out because this is completely out of shape. So that'll have to be replaced in its entirety. The front lens group looks pretty good. So it needs a rear lens group. The spring needs putting back onto the main lever. The shutter set, oh, there's something missing here. So there's a screw missing here. That's a locating post. It locates it at this point to stop the shutter from being able to turn inside the mount. So there's a screw missing there. It's difficult to tell from looking at that whether it's been chewed out or not. I think we'll find that out later. So the camera is going to need quite a bit of work, but most of the componentry appears to be present. Just check the action of that retard gear train. That appears to run down quite smoothly. That'll probably be fine. The diaphragm, what sort of state's that in? It's very stiff. That lever doesn't want to move. In fact, the tip of the lever is loose on the arm. Oh, yeah, it just moved in. So those blades are fairly marked. They don't look oily. Somebody might have been over enthusiastic in bending this to make the detent act stronger. So I would let's have a look at the body. It's certainly a fairly early example, you can tell because it doesn't have a roller here, it just has a guide. The action's quite smooth there. The leather on the base is not sitting flat, it's quite rippled. I suspect it's been off and perhaps stretched, not glued back particularly well. I'll see if I can peel that off, well it'll have to come off anyway. See if I can fix that up a bit. That's the wrong spring. The spring that's fitted here is the one that should be underneath this piece here. The two springs are almost identical, but the larger diameter spring, which is in this one in this case, and it's been had the ends cut off it in order to shorten it. It's the wrong spring for this job, and you can tell because it has to be forced down the tube. The correct spring, of course, is just a neat fit. Alright, well it looks like this could be an interesting job, because certainly a reasonable amount of my time will be taken up undoing the good work of the previous assembler. Looking down at the top here, you may be able to see that in the video. The distance between here and here is shorter than the distance from here to here, which means that the bellows struts are bent and will need to be straightened up. That means that the shutter and lens assembly is sitting cockeyed compared to the film plane, and it would be impossible to get a sharp image at the same distance from the camera focused all the way across the film. So there's a problem there. All in all, I'd say it's going to be an entertaining one. Well, I'll have the camera stripped right down now, ready to start cleaning it up. The first thing I've got to deal with is the base of the camera here. Where this leather's been glued down, there's some thick black deposit there. It almost looks like paint. I don't know what its purpose was, or whether it was an adhesive, but all that rubbish has got to come off before the leather goes back. The body is uniformly dirty inside, and I'll need to check the bellows to see if they're any good, of course. Well, here we have the bellows struts. As you can see, there's a certain amount of movement here, and of course it shouldn't have any. So looking to see where the movement was coming from, the first place it's coming from is the gap here. Now that's opened up, and I can see the rivet here is moving inside that gap from side to side. And to defeat this, what I'll have to do is crush this part together slightly in the vise to close it up. And we have a look at the other side, exactly the same effect is happening there. But that's not the only place that there's looseness. On the inside here, where this rivet post comes through, and it should be riveted firmly at this point. And at that point, you can see movement between here and here. This needs to be riveted over a little bit firmer. And the same on the other side. So hopefully, if I rivet this over a bit firmer, cross in that track slightly so it's slightly narrower at this point, and clean these struts up, check to make sure that the arms aren't bent, that the ends are at 90 degrees. Hopefully, once that's all done, the struts will be fit for use again. Otherwise, I'll have to find another set. And I hate finding more parts for cameras because they're hard to come by. Alright, I've pretty much finished with this, I think. I'm just checking now to see if there's any movement still. And trying to see where movement is happening. There's more flex than movement at this point. Quite pleased with that. And on this side, there's a little bit of movement here, so that track is not closed up quite enough on that side. I need to squeeze that closer together right at this point here, and I'll do that in the vise. And what I'll do is I'll put that track between the corner of the vise at that point and just squeeze the vise jaws up slightly, and that should crush that track in. In fact, I can see it has. It's probably too stiff now. That certainly took all the play out of that, but it's still moved. Once that's lubricated, and particularly once it's back in the camera and has been moved once or twice, I'm sure that will move quite nicely. So, I'll pop away that staking set, and these struts, I will now clean them, make any final adjustments to the struts to straighten them where they are bent, or bend them where they need to be bent. Make sure that the ends by the rivets here are squared up. Make sure that the frame at the back and the frame at the front are parallel. And all going well, that'll be ready to put back in the body. Well, it's Monday morning here now. I've last worked on this on Saturday, I think. And it's up to the stage now where everything's back together again. The struts have been sorted out. They sit nice and parallel, there's no rocking. Focus is nice and smooth, not that there was a problem there previously anyway. The film advance mechanism's back together. The only lingering problem here is the frame counter. The dial is about one notch off, so it locks in at frame number 2 instead of frame number 1. I've got a fair idea why that is. The dial, the counter dial, has been damaged. It's been incorrectly assembled. I think someone didn't line up the various components correctly and then did the screw up very tight and effectively mutilated the edge of the counter disc. So I may replace that disc. If that doesn't have any useful effect, it'll stay like that forever. So at the moment, the top of the camera is pretty much done. I need to disassemble and clean the glass and clean the top cover up completely to get that nice and clean. The rangefinder hasn't gone back into the body yet, but that has been cleaned that should be a simple job. And I have the shutter, or the shutter and lens assembly. You may remember that the lens assembly was damaged at the back. It had had drop damage. The glass was cracked and somebody had painted over that crack in order to make it vaguely usable. So I decided I didn't have a whole replacement rear group, which is what I would have needed. So the retainer ring, there was no danger of unscrewing that retainer ring because it was damaged, because it was pushed in, it was no longer round, there was no danger, or the mount for that matter was no longer round. There was no danger of unscrewing that. So I snapped that out, just levered that out, broke it away completely. It's very thin brass, wasn't a hard job. That allowed me to get out the remains of the lens, and it left me with the rear group. Well, the inner components of the rear group were in good condition. Now you might know that the Retina IIa in particular, the innermost glass elements on these lenses are often fogged up, and it's an oxidisation or some other process attacking the glass surface. It's not haze that's deposited on from something else that can be cleaned away. So the glass was otherwise in good condition. So I hunted out an outer, or the rearmost glass for this lens, and I found one in my collection. It's in good condition, it's quite adequate. It had a tiny chip mark in the corner, and I presume that's where someone had slipped with a tool and had marked it. It's a very small chip, but I put a tiny dot of black paint on that chip mark, and you can just see it there in the image, I think. It's a little dot of black paint, and that just effectively stops that damaged piece of glass from transmitting light, which would not project a useful image on the film, but it would possibly degrade the contrast. Given it's only a tiny chip, it would only be to a tiny degree, but painted out it'll give you no problems at all. The mount itself, that was pushed in, of course, where it had been dropped. The edge of it had been pushed right over. By judicious use of panel beating techniques, I was able to push this mount back out into a circular shape, and certainly it went better than I expected. And fitting another retainer ring, I was able to screw that retainer ring into place without any major problems, which quite surprised me. I was expecting more trouble than that. Assembling the shutter. Well, when I went to assemble the shutter, there was a couple of things I noted were missing. One was this screw here, which serves as a post to align this in the camera body with this slot in the tab here. And I thought that was missing, so I found one in my spares and fitted it. I also thought that the high-speed spring was missing. The 500th of a second spring was missing from the shutter, which it was, but both of those components were loose in the plastic bag with the other stray screws for the camera. So in practice those parts weren't missing at all. As to the shutter works quite well now, but I notice I've still got a problem. And the problem is this: the rack is unusually stiff. And it sort of sticks. So I suspect that when this lens and probably shutter assembly as one were dropped on the floor, which damaged and broke the lens, that also this housing has taken a thump and it's pushed it in slightly, so it's binding on the curved rack. So I've got to take this back off, see if I can see where the rubbing is happening, presuming that is the case, and manipulate this back into place. Typically speaking, it'll mean that there's a slight flat spot somewhere here on the curve, and it's just rubbing. Worst case scenario, of course, I'll just replace this whole rear piece. So that's my next task anyway. apart from that, the shutter assembly, that went quite smoothly, I would say. It's one of the old Compor Rapids, not the Synchro Compor, so you don't have the complicated MX flash sync arrangement. It all went fairly well. I had to remove the retard gear train from the plate in order to clean everything and make sure it was set correctly. That had been removed from the mechanism plate previously, and I could tell that because the return spring on the retard gear train has to be put back in a particular place so that its spring does not bind up across the range of its movement, and it was not quite correctly placed. That's an easy mistake to make, and it probably wouldn't cause an awful lot of trouble, but it was certainly something I wanted to deal with. So the retard gear train came off the plate, everything was cleaned. The whole camera was absolutely full of loose screws. Every screw in the camera was loose. Nothing was tight. So regardless of the fact that it seemed to work, it really needed to be taken right to pieces in order to make sure that it was correctly assembled with tightened screws. I did mention that the leather on the base of the camera, that was a bit of a mess. It's still not dead flat, as you can see. It's got a share of ripples along here, but we're rid of that nasty black stuff that was gluing it down. I've still got no idea what that black stuff was. I know it dissolved away fairly well with acetone. I was able to scrape away the bulk of it with a scalpel, and acetone it cleaned up the rest of it, and I was able to glue the leather back down, and it looks a lot tidier now. But as to what had been used to glue that in place, that's one of life's mysteries. It was like pitch or something. I've got no idea what it was. Like tar. Never mind. So my next task here, I think, is to sort out this shutter, find out what's going on with that rack, and hopefully straighten out the problem.